believe, as a consequence of that, that we have to support every policy that Angela Merkel puts. And it is quite clear. Let's not beat around the bush with bullshit about all the rights that Europe grants. Europe is primarily a German-led pan-European organisation to guarantee that the 50% of the economy of Germany that goes to exports and the 50% of those of its exports that go to Europe are guaranteed. That's why Greece was driven into the dust by the German government alongside the French. That's why Portugal was driven into the dust by the German government alongside the French. And Ireland was. And so the idea that the European Union is some hallowed, sacred institution that defends our rights is not true. Nor is the European Union an institution to defend the rights of migrants.
Excuse me.
Because, for example, in Hungary, they simply close the borders. They don't let foreigners in who they don't want to let in. And so the idea that the European Union has some universal rules on movement of people is not true. Not only that, the Austrians and the Germans began to introduce controls on the movement of people. So the idea of pan-European Union is a great thing. But the reality of it is the organisation that we have, the European Union, which is an institution that defends the power and privileges and economies of the two dominant powers, Germany and France.
And France, yeah.
Now, the problem lies in this for the European Union. Just the same as Britain is in an existential crisis in its relationship to Europe, so European Union itself is in an existential crisis. Right across the European Union, just the same as they say, you see, in Britain, this right-wing, what they call right-wing populist trend resulted in the Brexit vote. You could say that. But on the other side, you also have the same process affecting Europe. You have the German AfD. We don't even have a party like the AfD in Britain. And this is Germany, right? Something, I mean, how many members of parliament? 95 members of parliament or something like that. For the what's it called? Alliance, not Alliance for Germany, Alternative for Germany.
Alternative für Deutschland.
Sorry?
Alternative für Deutschland. Alternative for Germany.
Yeah. Alternative for Germany. I was going to say Alliance for Germany. That was 1990. I was going to say Alliance for Germany, but that was 1990 when Germany reunified. No. So what do we stand for? Why is Jeremy Corbyn insisting on a general election rather than a referendum?
Yeah.
Because we do not wish to overturn the decision taken by the people at the vote 2 years ago, for the simple reason that we said we wouldn't do so, and we are standing by what we said. Now that does not mean we support what the Tories are trying to do. We want to see a radical and dramatic transfer in the balance of wealth and power in Britain and internationally. And that means inside our country we have to sort out what happens inside Britain. And that means we want a Labour government to carry out a manifesto for education, welfare, healthcare right across the country, and to make an appeal to countries in Europe and outside of Europe to join together in a plan for common development and advance of the interests of the majority of the people. How do you do that? By reordering the balance of wealth and power in society in favour of the majority of the population who are excluded from access to wealth and power. Rent controls, control over the housing market, seize control of the empty buildings. These questions are fundamental to the lives of the people in Britain. Abolish tuition fees, provide grants for the students to go to university, renationalise the railways, build houses for the people, public sector houses, improve the wages of the workers, starting with a minimum of £10 an hour. Provide for reduce the working week, 35 hours at first, and then a 4-day working week and an 8-hour working day, with the intention of moving to a 4-day working week and a 6-hour working day. These are achievable objectives, provided you take control of the decisive levers of economic power in society. And it is perfectly true that that programme of change is also not possible inside the legal framework of the European Union. Doesn't mean you couldn't try and do it. The Greeks, after all, tried to overturn the decision of the Troika to impose austerity on the Greek people. The people held a referendum in Greece. And then Tsipras capitulated to the European Union in order to preserve his position and his power. And the problem is that undermined the authority of the left, which had gained over a struggle to try and create a new political force inside Greece. But unfortunately, Tsipras capitulated, and that's where we were. So we're not in an easy situation. I'm not going to pretend to you that the position which Corbyn's adopted is an attractive one for the population. It is not, because we have a binary conflict between remaining in the European Union and leaving the European Union on terms not decided by us. And therefore, the only alternative, in my view, one is a general election. If you wanted I'll take you one second. If you wanted a constitutional suggestion as to how things could be improved, I have one, and I argued for it over some time, but nobody's going to listen to me, and so it's not going to make any difference. But the constitutional alternative would be to what's traditionally the case, is when a country is in formation or in reformation, what they call is what's called a constituent assembly. An assembly composed of the elected representatives, or a newly elected body, of the different nations and regions in the country, to come together to decide what is done in society, what laws and constitution they want to have. Britain has no written constitution. Thus everything's made up effectively on the wing or on the base of past 1,000 years of legal precedent.
You're clearly a big fan of Jeremy Corbyn. Isn't it really the truth that he's just sitting on the fence? He's not a leaver or a remainer. Basically what he's trying to do is take advantage of the situation we're in order to get into Downing. Isn't that really the truth of Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, you could put it that way if you like.
If you were to pick a side, you'd probably say he's more of a leaver.
I say you can put it that way if you like. It doesn't bother me, because you said it yourself.
Yeah, but
you said it yourself. A leaver or a remainer, one or the other. Society is not as binary as that. Society is actually divided in completely different ways. Whether we leave or remain ultimately will make a lot less difference than most people imagine, because the European Union itself is an organisation representing big business in Europe. The country called Great Britain, in the institutions of Parliament, are institutions which defend the interests of big business and the City of London in Britain. That's the reality of the world we live in. But we have been told and the view has been promoted and propagated and multiplied and exacerbated, the divisions increased as a result of the vote over Brexit in 2016. And since that time, almost every family in Britain has spent their time, and the television and radio and pundits have spent their time arguing about this question of identity and of the European Union. The consequence of that is that, yes, when you argue about the rights and interests of the working classes of society, you're ignored, because people say, well, that's not the issue we're discussing. The big issue in Britain is, do you leave or do you remain in the European Union? Yeah. And therefore we are stuck between a pillar and a hard place. I don't deny that. But in order to escape from that situation, given the correlation of forces in the Labour Party and society, I believe Jeremy Corbyn is correct to sit back and say, let the Tories tear themselves apart. It's not our job to save Theresa May, and it's not our job to save Rees-Mogg.
Is it going past search to Labour? Is it going to what we need as a country? And you say that it's a binary.
What do you mean by a country?
Well, we should it all be put in to benefit for our
The
country,
problem is...
not for fighting against the left and the right, which you were saying shouldn't be binary, there should be a mix-up between it all. And also,
No, that's not what I said. I said the binary is the division. I said the binary is the division between leaving the European Union or remaining in the European Union.
Want to leave from, what parts are good of it's not just a leave or stay.
Well, that's fair enough. I've got no problem with that. I've got no problem with it. Everybody in the world, everybody in Britain would like to say that I'd like to take the best bits of membership of the European Union. And what the definition of that is a subjective or political choice. In relation... Sorry?
That's not what people voted for. When people voted to leave, they voted to leave the single market, the customs union.
Well, I didn't say that is what people voted for, but it is what people voted for in this respect. That people weren't given a choice. It's not true to... No, it is not true to say... Hang on. It is not true to say that people voted on the customs union. They didn't. They voted on membership of the European Union, full stop. Yes or no? There was no detail involved. Right?
This is why you should have a...
Hang on a minute. Hang on. I am not arguing that there should have been detail. I'm just saying there was no detail.
There was no detail in the first place, so why we're in the first place?
No, what you asked me, what the gentleman here asked was slightly different, though.
What about all the story, the bullshit story they sold to you to get you to vote leave? Okay. Well, now you know it's not the truth. About the,
What the gentleman here was asking was a different question, though. You intervened because you assumed it was question time.
So let's say the bank Treasury, what they say would happen after.
Do you want to speak at least to the meeting, or else hold a separate
So
meeting?
the Treasury said, if there was a leave vote, if we were successful, there would be a recession immediately. There would be job losses.
I don't care what they
There
said.
would be economic stagnation.
What about it?
None of it happened. We've grown 5.
What about it?
Well, the economy's
No, but I'm not defending that. So I don't know what you're arguing with me about.
People in jobs than there ever have been.
What is the argument?
Yeah, but there's more people in jobs.
What is the argument? Sorry, mate. Excuse me. What is the argument with what I was responding to him? What is your intervention?
I was responding to him, but
No,
you were
but
saying...
listen.
I was
This is
responding
not.
to you in leave and
This is
remain.
not.
Leave means leave, as in not member of the customs union, not member of the single market, not ruled by the European
Look,
Court of Justice.
Did you hear what I said?
We didn't have the detail. You didn't have the detail.
What I said was.
Why the details?
I didn't have the
details
details.
did you have?
Exactly, that's why I voted to remain, not leave, because I didn't have any detail.
What about Project
I
Fear?
said.
Did you have a recession? Did you have a recession?
No, because we've
Were there
technically
job
not
losses?
left yet.
Were there job losses?
Not left.
Sorry. What I said was.
Immediately after the vote, he would have a recession.
Look,
No, it won't be. There'll be a recession.
but what if there is?
They said there'll be a recession post-Brexit.
You see, the gentleman here is engaging, and I understood this. One of the reasons I've avoided this discussion at Speaker's Corner is because I've had it at home, I've had it in my environment, and I know it goes nowhere. And you watch it on telly, and everyone's got their two-piece, their 2 pence to add, and their 2 pence to add leads them to a heated argument with their next-door neighbour, and they're arguing on terms entirely decided by the establishment. That's the truth of the matter. Because whether the gentleman here is arguing, oh, leave said leave, there was no detail, fair enough. The gentleman, he didn't ask me that, though. What he asked was, what is good... One second, you've been intervening. Did I argue that? Did I? But you're standing in front of me. You're standing in front of me.
What about the
Hang
falling
on, hang on.
There you go.
You are standing in front of me. Who are you arguing against?
Remainers.
But am I a Remainer?
I don't know.
Exactly, you don't know. You don't know. But you've been speaking for 10 minutes, having come to the meeting and had a go at me
I didn't have a go at
about
you.
something
I'm
I
just
never
saying, make sure that you get your
advocated.
facts straight.
Sorry?
I'm just making sure you get your facts straight.
But you didn't know what the argument was about to have the facts about.
Being in the best bits of the European Union.
No, the gentleman here asked me. No, that's not what the argument was about.
No, but that's the point
He
that he
asked
made. He
me.
said we can stay with the
No,
best
no,
bits,
he
but that's not-
asked me. Let me explain what it was.
Okay.
He asked me, are there not good things about membership of the European Union? And I mentioned a few. And I said it depends who you are, which ones you think are good. Right? Now, yes, subjective. And that's why the entire discussion is at such a low intellectual level. But that's the level that we're at in Britain. Because people are stuck into the binary division.
Just blaming both sides. You know, shouting.
I am blaming both
I'm
sides.
not saying you are. I'm just saying they're going back.
I
and forth
am
and
blaming
not
both
actually doing their
sides.
own research.
Yes, not because it's about research, but because the primary issue is a misunderstanding of society we live in. The discussion, someone turned around and said, I think it was the guy who was there a minute ago, he said, oh yeah, but this is about what our country does. Right? As if the Leave voters or the Remain voters, whether we leave or remain, have any say about what happens in our country.
We should leave.
Well,
Why?
that's right. The gentleman here says.
All right, okay,
You're the only. Most
me-
people who voted to leave, they don't actually know what they voted
How
for.
do you know that?
Well,
Because I've
but
spoken to
my
loads of
friend,
your-
my friend,
No,
my
you've
friend.
spoken to loads, so you've got anecdotal evidence to support this
My friend.
spurious claim that you're making.
The argument that you will have as a consequence of leaving the European Union.
We want to hear the speaker, please.
He keeps poking at
No,
me.
you began over there, then wandered over here to engage in discussion with him.
I'm allowed to
Because
engage in discussion.
you are, but ideally, given the fact that I'm speaking on a platform and have been doing so for 32 years, if you wish to engage in the debate which is going on in this meeting, rather than the debate which is going just on television, right, in which I understand you feel frustrated because you don't get a role in that debate. And that's the very nature of politics in Britain, is that you don't actually have a say, and the idea that they've been proposing is they say, well, this is the biggest exercise in democracy in British history. And don't forget, Britain is supposed to be the citadel
That's not necessarily
of world
true.
democracy.
There was a general
And
election,
so,
I can't remember.
hang on. No, the biggest participation.
There was a larger turnout in the, I think it was like...
No, there wasn't a larger
There was,
turnout.
numerically, there was.
Well, I'm sorry, it'll only take you 1 second to check that on your phone. But let's leave that aside until you've done that. Let's leave that aside. The question is, that is how the issue is posed. We had a huge vote involving millions of people in Britain to decide what happens in this country. That's the argument as it's posed by Theresa May. That's what she's arguing. And the Conservative Party as a whole are arguing that.
But should we respect that
Now,
decision?
sorry?
Should we respect that decision going into the...
I have said since the beginning of this meeting and since the time of the referendum itself that I respect the decision that people took. I've said that all along. It took you a while to get to that question though, didn't it?
Just wondering, because there are people here...
I don't care whether there are people here. I'm speaking on a platform. Right? Of course there are people here who argued to remain. There are people here who argue to leave, like yourself. Good on you. The problem is, both of them, those who argue to remain and those who argue to leave, are utterly and completely impotent. Utterly and completely impotent. Now, yes, I do know what the definition of impotence is. Theresa May, take for example. She's the Prime Minister of the country. And yet, she's utterly and completely impotent. So why do you think that you or that he have a bigger say in this?
Because I think that if you had somebody who was, you know, a Leave voter, for example, that was in charge of...
Yeah, but you don't have the parliamentary arithmetic for that.
For a Leave
Who?
mandate. But that's because she called a general election. She had a majority.
Who do you have
and
to
then
do
she called
that?
a general election.
Who do you have who could do
The
that?
name of who
Name me
can
one
do that?
member of parliament who could do that. Huh?
David Davis.
He was the
But you know damn well, as everybody else knows.
It's like me quitting my job and then going back to
I mean, you've obviously followed the news assiduously. You've obviously followed the news assiduously about Leave and Remain. You've obviously followed the debates for the last 2 years. Oh, you're not interested in discussion, no?
Celebrity and selling books in his column in the fucking Telegraph. He's not interested in leading.
You're not interested in discussion.
No, I am, always.
Okay, so what did I say?
I was just arguing about Boris Johnson.
Yeah, but what did I say to you in response to what you said?
Sorry, I wasn't listening.
Right. So the issue was, I said, if the Prime Minister of the country is utterly impotent in relation to the leave or remain, well, he's calling for a general election.
Well, how is that going to help things?
Oh, that changes everything. He's
Well, what else?
Loudly has he called for what?
What else? What else do you expect him to do?
Table a motion of no confidence.
Yes, in order to get a general election, not in order to lose the vote. Well, my friend, what you want, that's a different issue. As opposed to the gentleman here, what you want is another referendum. No, what you want is another referendum where even more people turn out to make another impotent vote.
And another one.
Yes.
And then another one.
Well,
Best of three.
I know that's your position.
I want endless referendums. I'm
Well,
addicted.
no, you simply want to remain in the European Union because you believe the world will collapse if we leave the European Union.
We should settle it.
Sorry?
We should settle it with the end of rock, paper, scissors.
No, the issue is what you said earlier on. You said someone needs to do it. Well, who's going to do it? Then you said David Davis. A huge round of applause in the audience burst out. Yes, we're all begging and baying for David Davis to save the world. But it's simply not going to happen, is it? So what you actually have is an utter and complete political paralysis in British society.
What would you do?
That is the reality of what you've got.
What would you do?
You're going on about saying both sides are wrong. You're saying
make a decision.
leavers are wrong, remainers are wrong. So what's your realistic
I am
solution
saying the
that you bring to the
belief.
table?
I am saying the belief that you actually have fundamental control over the process happening in your country or in the European Union is false. We do not control the political process or the economic process.
So you're opposed to the whole process?
I'm trying to explain to you what my view is.
I'm trying to understand your view.
Well, you're not making a great deal of effort. As soon as I finish one sentence, you want a clarification.
You're just sitting on the fence. You won't
I'm not sitting on the fence at all.
Honestly, I've stood here for half an hour. I still don't know what your position is.
On relation to what?
Brexit.
Well,
don't have one.
I'm quite clear. I want to see British society controlled and run by the people rather than run by the interests of big business. I want to see Europe controlled and run by the people. I want to see the world controlled and run by the people. And the only method to achieve that is by a fundamental transformation in the balance of wealth and power in society from the wealthy to the majority, which means the following: public ownership of the commanding heights of the economy, of the banks and major industries. And unless you have such a transformation in the balance of power, the living standards and conditions of the masses will not improve. However, if you do want to improve the living standards and conditions of the masses, we have clear indications as to how that is possible. One is, for example, one second, I'll take you next. One is, if you look across to France at what happened over the last few weeks, within a few days of protesting, in fact 4 weeks of protesting, French protesters managed to force an intransigent, utterly immovable president to concede to the demands of the people. They gave wage increases, they promised changes to the conditions of the people in relation to minimum wages, in relation to approaches to workplace rights, workers' conditions and so on. That is a big improvement. It's simply in a matter of weeks because of protest on the streets. Protest on the streets, if that is backed by parliamentary change, can also facilitate improvements in the legislative framework in society. That means a Labour government would be able to introduce changes in British society to improve the wages, improve the housing, improve the living standards of the people. What?
It's nonsense. That's not a realistic option.
It's not even a plan. Jeremy Corbyn made a complete...
I don't know.
In fairness, you said you'd go to
It's hardly the same situation. I understand your concern. I accept your concern. I do not believe there's the slightest bit of Stalinism within that.
Can I ask a question?
Class basically dominating the minority, the majority. Yes, one example from history.
My friend, there are, in the history of socialism, various strands of socialism. One of the strands that, for example, you have mistaken for a Stalinist strand is the social democratic strand. The social democratic strand has held power in governments in Sweden, Germany, France, Spain, Italy. Sorry?
They've got deregulation in the markets, they've got vast oil.
But you asked me the question, when is a socialist government...
I said communist.
Well, but you were talking about the Labour Party.
I said communist.
But you were talking about the Labour Party.
Yeah.
So what are you talking about? The Labour Party has never been run by communists.
You can only respond directly to the question. If you deviate in any way, then...
No, that wasn't the question he asked. If you want to change the question, fine. The problem was when you started questioning, you made the initial assumption, which was utterly false, about what my point of view was, and then you jumped for 10 minutes. You blabbered on for 10 minutes, assuming that my position was the one you wanted to attack.
Mr. Speaker, you haven't kept your promises. You said you'd
generating someone
about the nationalisation of industry to the state. Problem, what if the evil rich people don't want to give up their assets? What do we do with them? I mean,
Has it ever
killing
occurred
them
to you that
didn't
perhaps
work
they're the
last
right
time.
people to be controlling them? Hierarchies exist in all sorts of
The gentleman here has a very important
this
question.
whole idea of communism just
Let me
doesn't
try and
work.
respond to it. I know you've got a very smart point of view and you're very well educated, but the gentleman here has just posed a question.
Okay.
Because you can answer that question, you can't answer his question.
I don't know what his question was. What was it? What was his
I
question?
wanted to ask you a question when you were
What
talking
was your
about...
question?
Can you answer his
Well,
question?
what you tell me what his question was. So you don't know what you're talking about. So I'm going to respond to his.
You are not here and you don't know
You're
what is his
simply
question.
backing him up.
Huh?
You backed him up in asking his question. When one is he hasn't asked a question, two is you didn't hear it. So what are you talking about?
Your argument
Just don't like me. Fair enough. But don't talk shit to me. Exactly. That's what you're on about.
It's become diluted because you are becoming personal. Your argument is diluted.
The gentleman here asked me a question. I'm trying to answer him.
Can you please stop getting distracted and answer his question?
Okay.
The gentleman here said...
His argument is diluted. The decorum of the debate
I thought I was going to answer him.
Answer his
My friend,
question.
I've been speaking 32 years.
Okay, just answer his
Perhaps you
question.
can tell me your experience. Now,
The
the gentleman here asked
Do you want me to re-elaborate
it
again?
means something to me.
raise myself to tell you
The gentleman here asked...
ignorant person.
The gentleman here asked...
Ignoramus.
Sorry? The gentleman here asked, won't the wealthy be opposed to a transfer in the balance of wealth and power? Yes. Of course they will. Of course they will. Just the same as Remainers and Leavers militantly defend their position, so I believe I have a right to militantly defend the position that regardless of whether the wealthy would like to hand over their wealth and power, regardless of whether the banks would like to be nationalised, regardless of whether landlords would like to see rents controlled, regardless of whether companies that keep empty buildings empty all over Britain would like to have their properties seized, still we should be able and willing to do those things,
Okay, may I ask-
regardless of whether they like it or not.
Mr. Speaker, what happens?
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
Who are you, the judge? Are you God? Are you deciding
I'm
that you can just
advocating
seize the
a
property?
policy.
Mr. Speaker,
I'm advocating a policy.
You can't judge everyone yourself. You're basically...
I can advocate whatever policy I like to.
You can. But you are saying that you
My
want
friend,
to judge people. You can just remove
I
their
didn't say anything of the
What
sort.
do you think will happen?
I didn't say anything of the sort.
Answer.
In
What
Britain,
do you think will
in
happen?
Britain,
What will happen?
If you went around and you seize
What will
everybody.
you said
happen?
something, I'm going to answer. Well,
Do you advocate rent control?
sorry?
Do you advocate rent control?
Of course I advocate rent control.
What's happened every other time rent controls have been instituted?
He also advocates seizing of
Another
assets
time.
from the welfare.
In Germany, in Britain,
Actually, in New
we've had rent
York,
control
in
in
New York
Britain.
they have rent control.
We've had rent control in Britain. The government under Margaret Thatcher abolished it. And rents went skyrocketing.
Actually, if I may say so.
Sorry?
What happens to the quality of accommodation?
My friend, I don't know if you where you've been, but
Ask the question, can you answer it?
I'm answering your question. I don't know where you've been. I am answering you directly, sir. I don't know where you've been, but in case you didn't bother to find out,
32 years.
Britain has the worst quality housing stock, rented housing stock, in the whole of Europe. Britain has the worst quality housing. Check it on the internet.
Your rhetoric
Check it
is
on the
abusive.
internet.
Your rhetoric is flawed.
I
Your
know that
rhetoric
housing here
has
is
become
better.
abusive because your ideology.
Why, because I don't agree with him.
No, your
He
rhetoric's
wasn't abusive.
abusive.
He's a very kind man.
Yeah,
I mean, he's wrong
I
about
may not be polite all the time. I'm speaking at Speaker's Corner.
Your statement about housing.
Thank you.
That's your statement about housing.
how he felt.
Why is my statement about housing rubbish?
Because it's definitely not the worst in Europe. It's the worst place. Go to
Check on the
Romania, go to
internet.
Eastern
Check
Europe.
on the internet.
I'm not.
Check in your pocket.
How are you going to
Do a
arbitrate?
search.
Sorry, how are you going to arbitrate whether somewhere is better than somewhere else?
Well, this is a pan-European study. I'm not responsible for the study. So yes, if there are flaws in the study, I'm not responsible.
There is. He won't take
I'm
responsibility
not-
once again.
Hang on, so
I
you're
can't be responsible for a study.
I didn't do the study. I don't know what I'm talking about.
That's not what I said. I think I know what I'm talking about. I just don't agree with you. You're saying you know what you're talking about. You don't agree with me? Well, that's fair enough.
I may say.
Fair enough. If the study might be flawed, fair enough. That's a
Of course, any study can be
It's a
flawed.
possibility. It's a possibility. But still, I think it's a very big thing to say
Well-
that Britain has the worst housing. Because Britain is far from being the poorest country in Europe. And
It's not about whether you're the poorest country in
it has
Europe.
a lot to do
It's
with
about how the housing stock
You know what
has
is
been
GIB
allowed to
per
run
capita?
down. I was
GIB per
asked a
capita.
specific question.
him finish.
The question was about
him
rent
finish.
controls. The rent control issue I pointed out was abolished under Margaret Thatcher. I remember calling for the rent officer to come and impose rent control in the building I lived in. He came round, the rent was £20 a week, he imposed £10 a week, back in 1983. Right?
let
I
him
remember that.
finish.
In Germany, there are rent controls. The housing stock is of a far superior quality in Germany than it is in Britain. That does not mean that there's a direct...
Move to Germany.
What a childish argument.
No, it's
That does not mean there's a
your
direct
rhetoric is
correlation
childish. Your
between
rhetoric
rent
is
control
childish. You can't
and the quality of
quantify what you're
housing.
saying.
But it does mean that the argument that rent
He's
control...
talking rubbish. We're 10th. Look.
10.
It's worse in Austria.
Show me-
It's worse in Ireland. It's worse in
Austria,
Norway.
sorry,
Finland.
the quality of
Netherlands,
housing stock
Sweden,
is worse in Austria.
Germany.
Oh, no, the
Show me the
internet.
study. Show me the study. Show
No,
me the
I'm not
study.
showing it. Go
Show
Google it
me-
yourself.
show me the
Look,
study.
I can
Show
see
me the
it.
study.
I can
Just
see it.
show me what the reference is.
No, no, I can see it. He doesn't want to show
Independent.
you. I
Google
can
it.
see
Show
it.
me the reference.
Independent.
Show me
I'm not
the
giving you my phone.
reference. Just for a second.
No, sorry about
No, your company's might steal it. Who knows?
that. I'll show it to everyone. Look.
What is the
man, you'll take your phone
reference? What
and
is
make
the
it
article?
proper.
Number 10.
What is the
You said
article?
worse in
What
Europe.
is the article?
Exactly.
It's not from his source.
No, 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 no.
I just want to know what the article is.
Doesn't agree with
He
what
hasn't
he's saying.
cited
So therefore
anything.
he
it's the wrong
disregards
source.
it.
I
Claim.
agree with you, so it's the wrong source.
What's the article?
The
Harvard.
rhetoric is
Harvard,
abusive.
what's the article?
Man is abusive.
What's the article? What's the article?
About this.
What's
No,
the date? What's the date?
It's about
housing.
What's the date and the source?
It's got worse.
Date and source. That's all I want to know.
April 2016, independent.
I know in the last
April what?
April 2016.
April what? 2016.
28. What does that matter?
So I can search for it
Okay,
and
sorry,
check.
yeah. Go on. 28th of April 2016. Do you want
Okay,
a time?
fair enough, fair enough.
No. April 20 what?
28.
What's the title of the article?
The man at Speaker's Corner.
17 major European countries rank by standard of living, which includes housing.
Standard of living.
And housing.
You see?
Housing.
Standard of living.
And
housing.
You're talking about living.
Why cut him off before you hear the whole
That's
name?
not what the article's about, though, is it?
Yes, it is.
The article's not about the standard of housing.
That's very spirited.
Mr. Speaker,
Look, I happen to have.
The standard of housing is the main component of the standard of living.
Okay, never mind. I'll do the search and put it up for you.
Mr. Speaker,
All right? Just quickly, I'll do the search and put up an article that deals with the issue we've just been discussing, rather than a different. I'm not saying the article will be comprehensively correct on everything. I will tell you what the article is. I will cite it, refer to you, and you can then check yourselves. What I just got from the gentleman here was an article about a totally different subject, claiming that he'd proven his case.
Liar!
That's the only thing.
Liar!
It wasn't totally different. Stop naming.
It was about housing and living.
You said it's about...
Out of 17
Just have a look.
richest countries in Europe, and we were 10th. There was 9 other countries worse than this country. It's total nonsense what you're saying about housing being the worst in Europe. It's not true.
So you're saying
housing worse than Albania, Romania?
wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
The experts are
You've
wrong.
not
The experts could be wrong, I don't know.
You've not been to Eastern Europe.
Exactly.
You've been to Eastern Europe. You've
They're
been to
really
parts
Now
of
there's a
parts of
relevant
Ukraine.
point. You have a relevant point there. Probably the study I referred to was about Western Europe. Probably you're right.
I'll
give you a qualification. I'm accepting that.
Well, you forgot the Western bit, didn't you?
I'm just doing the search.
what about the bit of Italy?
Well, the Western Europeans have very high
doing the
standards
search.
of living to begin with. So being the worst between them is not actually that bad.
What's it like in Corsica?
It's actually pretty good.
I didn't say every area of every country
the biggest economy in
superior.
Europe.
I'm trying to find the article. You can wait for a couple of seconds. Not such a big deal.
Yeah, let's let him.
Well, I think we've settled it. You just forgot to say Western Europe.
It could be that, but even if it was Western Europe, we're adequate to deal
Well,
with.
it's not that bad then, is it? We're talking about Germany, France.
I mean, yeah, they're pretty desirable countries.
We're not talking about third world countries here. When you say Europe, you're including Romania. No disrespect to Romania, Albania, and these countries. Their housing state's not better than UK. So what you're saying is
true. That's why I've just qualified what I said.
Okay, may I ask you a question on
You
taxation?
may indeed, while we're still at it.
Okay, if somebody told you that 20% corporation tax would give more money to the state than 30% corporation tax, would you choose the 20% over the 30%? Or are you so widely logical about things?
It depends what depends what corporations you're planning to. It depends what corporations you're planning to tax.
But do you look at this from a rational point of view or an ideological, envious point of view?
I look at it from a rational point of view.
So therefore, you'd lower it if you wanted to boost revenue in order to have more money for our public services, surely?
If that were the case, I would be prepared to lower
so why do you want to
corporation
raise,
tax on certain sectors. However, what I'm arguing is something slightly different. I'm not arguing for allowing the private ownership of all the major companies, and but I'm just stating what I'm arguing. I'm sorry that I'm clarifying what I'm arguing rather than what you're arguing. I don't know what you're arguing. That's why. The gentleman here asked me.
He was asking about tax, and so I was just.
He asked me about corporation tax, and were it lower, and that was shown to bring higher revenues that could be spent on public services, would I support such a thing? And I gave a qualified yes, provided, and this is the proviso I'm adding, so can I finish? Providing the dominant sectors of the economy are in public hands.
What are the dominant sectors of the economy?
By that I mean the largest 150 companies, including the banks, insurance companies and so on. And in that way, you would have sufficient resources to plan the development of the economy and thereby to facilitate, yes, even private sector development, alongside a general planned development of the productive potential of the country.
So if I could ask a question to everybody that's here, who here, if you put your hand up, who here thinks that if put in charge of a bank, they could run it efficiently?
That's a good question.
My friend, did I say that anyone here should be put in charge of a bank? Public ownership does not mean or imply that every person in this meeting would become the bank manager. Since when has public ownership meant that? The government, for example, took majority stakes
So the
in
government that we've got that
three
can't even
key
negotiate
banks.
a Brexit deal
The
should be in
government
charge of a
took
business.
the government took majority stakes in 3 key banks in Britain, and yet they did not change the managerial structure. So it is not automatic that a publicly owned bank has a purge of its general management.
So who was in
It
charge
could
of-
be
so
that
who
you
was
should
in
have a
charge of
purge.
RBS in 2008?
It could be that you should have a
Who
purge.
was in charge
But
of
the
RBS?
assumption that
Who was in
you
charge of
made,
RBS in
the
2008?
assumption that you made,
Answer the
in order to
fucking
mock
question.
my argument,
You won't listen to
I'm
anything
answering
that I
what
say.
you
said that
said.
there wasn't a change in
Instead
management.
of accepting that I answer what you say, you've decided to move the goalpost from your
No,
original
I'm not
argument,
I'm saying,
which
okay,
was
so we're talking
that
about
if
banking.
I
We're
argue,
talking about banking.
if I argue for public ownership of the banks,
Who was in charge?
you said
Who was in charge
that
of RBS in
means
2008?
anybody here will run the bank.
Who's in charge of RBS
Right?
in 2008?
I don't know.
Fred Goodwin. Who was in charge of RBS in 2009?
But it was particularly
Stephen Hester.
rampant.
So you said there wasn't
That's
a change
one
in management when
person.
it was nationalised.
One
That's not
person.
true.
It's not only one person runs a bank, my friend.
Well, I think when you put somebody in charge of a bank, the chief executive is the chief.
Not only one person.
They do
My
run
argument, however, was to point out
So how many people lost
that
their
public
job in RBS
ownership of the
in
banks
2008?
does not mean either that Goodwin needs to be in charge or that someone in this audience needs to be in charge. You have technical competence. You have the needs and planning of the government at of the day. You have the needs and planning and skills developed inside the business, and therefore the selection process is a process that would not be decided by you or I in all likelihood. Did I say that it would be?
Okay,
No.
so allow me to make my
So
point.
there,
No,
hang
allow me
on,
to
hang
answer.
on.
No, no, allow me to
Therefore,
answer.
the argument is spurious to say that because there is public ownership of banks, that therefore banks will be run by a numbskull who has no education and knowledge about it, which is what you're implying my argument was.
Don't try and
It's a
make
false
don't try and make a
implication.
straw man out of me. Don't
That's
try and
what
tell
you
me
did.
That's not what I
That's
said.
what you
That's
did.
not what I
Yeah,
said.
you said that everybody here
Do you know what that is?
then
In
run
debating,
the
you're
bank.
trying to make a straw
You
man
said
out of me.
if
That's what you did, my
everybody here
friend.
runs the
It
bank.
is what
That's
you
what
did.
That's what
When I
socialism
said
is about.
public
That's
ownership of
what
the banks,
Okay, so let me
you
ask you a
stopped.
question.
Hang on.
No, no, let
You
me ask you a
said.
question.
You
You
then
weren't
said,
asking me to
who
anything
here
about
could
it.
run the bank? That's what
Yeah.
you said,
Yeah.
right? So don't tell me about
So if
straw
you
dog,
nationalise-
about straw.
So if you, okay, straw man.
Dolls.
Straw man. So if you nationalise a bank,
Yeah.
and you're not going to make any changes to the staff, so you're going to make no fundamental changes whatsoever between the people.
I didn't say that either.
I know, I'm asking you a question.
You
I didn't
said
say that you said
when
that.
you
I
take
asked
into
you a
public
question,
ownership.
and you can answer the
I
question.
didn't say that.
Listen, hear me out.
Right.
So if there are no fundamental changes in staff.
I
when
didn't
it's
say
private-
that.
I'm asking you a question.
And there will be fundamental
Zip
changes in
it.
staff.
I'll tell you when you
I
can
don't know
answer.
what they will be.
Zip it, okay? No
Right.
changes. If there are no changes.
But I'm not going to advocate that.
Okay, guys,
Let
let
him
them
ask- let him
disrupt each other. Let
I'm
each other
asking you a
speak. Let each
question.
other speak. Turn.
If there are no fundamental changes in staff when it's privately owned and then it's nationalised, what is the point of it being nationalised versus it being privately owned? Because the staff are the same, so the actions will be the same, so the end product will be the same. So you're effectively saying that profit should be shared to the
Go
government
over there,
and
to
not
the shop over there. If you invest in that shop to produce souvenirs, and you invest in that shop to produce food, it's a shop. If you invest in that, I mean, this is the dictionary definition of a pedant,
Okay.
right? That's what it is.
It's a nice word.
And you're the dictionary definition of a Jobson.
But what?
Jobson. Exactly. You don't even know what that is.
I don't know what it is. I didn't even hear it.
It's a peasant with low intellect.
Oh, no, you didn't.
I mean, I've got a doctorate.
Okay.
It might be a bad thing to have, but I have a doctorate.
You should be in charge of the NHS. You could probably run it better than the
It's a
people running it now,
doctorate.
right?
I'm not a doctor of medicine.
Okay.
A doctorate
Okay, what do you have a doctorate in?
in Chinese political economy.
Really?
Knew it.
Well,
Chairman
if
Mao.
in that shop,
It's a cafe.
that makes me Chairman Mao, does it? So if I understand Chinese political economy, I'm Chairman Mao.
When did I say you're Chairman Mao? I just said Chairman Mao.
What's Chairman Mao got to do
So
with it?
you're saying
So
he's Chairman
if
Mao.
that shop,
That is what you said because you weren't
if that
listening. You
shop,
won't listen to anything that I
if
said.
that shop
It's a cafe.
is run to sell sweets, or run to sell food,
Yep.
or run to sell souvenirs,
Yep.
it's got different objectives, methods of operating, sales pitches,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
so on.
I don't
right?
think they think it's
So if a bank, even with the same people theoretically in charge. A theoretical proposition you posed to me, I didn't select it. Even in those circumstances, a bank can be made to do something different.
So we should tell them
Let me give you an example, just to piss you off.
So we let
When Lenin came to power in Russia, what he said was, we will not nationalize the large companies. Instead, we will tell the managers what they will do. And if they don't do it, we'll arrest them. So in that way, I said I knew it would piss you off. I said I knew it would piss him off.
So you've got an expert
pointing out. I am merely pointing out. I'm just merely pointing out that there is no law that says because someone is in a position, a specific.
Telling bankers what to do.
I didn't advocate that. I merely said that's what they did
communist.
in order to illustrate to you the flexibility that can exist, even with the same people in command. Let me give you another example, one that you'll like. When Leon Trotsky, you will like this one. Some of you, I'm sure you'll repeat it to somebody else. When Leon Trotsky was in charge of the Red Army in Russia, in 1922, he met with Lenin, and Lenin said, I hear you've got too many Tsarist generals and officers inside the Red Army. Can't you purge them? And Trotsky said, do you know how many we've got? Officers and generals from the old order in the Red Army. And Lenin said, no, he said, oh, we've got 10,000. 10,000 people from the old order.
Don't charge them, just throw them in jail. Arrest them, get rid of them.
My friend, the point was that having been Tsarist officers for the Tsar of Russia and fought in the First World War to defend the nation and the Tsar under the control of the Bolsheviks, they fought on behalf of the Bolshevik government. So therefore the argument you're making that all representatives...
You don't know the argument that I'm making. Stop saying the argument that I'm making.
The argument you were making in relation to banking, transposed into the general structure of the ruling classes, is incorrect. Yes, people are changeable. Yes, people can be made to change their view. Yes, constraints can be imposed that force them to do things.
But who's better qualified? Who's going to tell a banker what to do?
So you will have an expert in charge of a bank, and then you want to tell him what to do.
My friend, now you're coming on to absurdity multiplied by absurdity.
No, it's because it's reductive.
In 2008, in case you were probably too young to remember, but in 2008, the entire world economy was brought to the brink of collapse. Most people, well, that explains your ignorance. Most people who understand about what happened in 2008 blame the leaders of the banks in the largest banks in the world for bringing about the point whereby the entire world's banking system was on the point of collapse. And you, my friend, are the person who says these people are irreplaceable. You can never replace the great bank managers of the world.
Again, I didn't say that. I said...
That's the implication of your argument.
They are not irreplaceable, but you need to replace them gradually if you need to do so.
My friend, they did that after 2008.
That's regulation. That's
Sorry?
regulation.
What do you think regulation is?
Exactly that.
What is regulation, my friend? What does it mean, regulation? What does... Sorry?
This is exactly how you should do your job.
Who said that?
In the parameters that are set out by a governing body or an individual.
What do you think the law is, my friend?
The same thing.
It's regulation of the actions of people within a society.
So do you think we need
if
more
you
regulation or less regulation?
Of course, in relation to the banks, we need much more regulation. The banking system in Britain...
What do you think would happen to the financial services industry if we increase regulation? Do you think it would stay in London, or do you think it would move to Singapore or to Hong Kong?
My friend,
or
you worked in a bank, did you? You worked in a bank?
I worked in a bank.
Right. What were you, bank teller or cleaner, or what were you?
I worked at a derivative.
Sorry?
I works in the derivatives.
You worked in the derivatives section, and then you're telling me about running the banks. You're involved in the derivatives section.
About it than you do.
Sorry?
I know more about it than you do.
More about what?
Banking.
More about derivatives. What about it?
I don't really see where you're going with this. You're talking
Well,
about
the point is, everybody knows that it was derivatives that were...
What is a derivative?
They're derivatives of a possibility for future options.
Explain to me what a derivative is without using the word derivative.
Well, derivatives are products that are derived from something.
What are they derived from?
They're derived, in this particular case, probably from future options on how something might develop.
And how do they benefit people?
Well, that's your argument, not mine.
Okay, so
you're the one who's saying they benefit
fine,
people.
okay, so let's say
I'm saying they. Speculation. Speculate. No, because you feel on firm ground.
Okay, so
because you feel on firm ground about your derivatives.
No, hear me out. Hear me out on this one. So let's say I'm a cocoa farmer, right? And I want to secure my profits 5 years down the line. And so what I do is I package all of that up into a futures contract, for example, and then I sell that for a steady market price, which enables me to invest in my farm, hedging against volatility, so it ensures long-term supply, so individuals like yourself can go and buy a chocolate. How is that bad for an economy? How is that bad for an individual? How is that bad for society?
It depends on the circumstances. It depends on the circumstances.
I don't know what you're talking about.
You asked me a question. How is it bad? You told me. Hang on. You just told me in great clarity to everybody and myself. You told me what you're talking about, right?
So I made a positive case.
Future sales, future profits, 5 years down the road for a cocoa farmer. You just told me that. And then when I attempted to respond to you, you said, I don't know what you're talking about. When I was only talking about what you're talking about.
So I'm asking you to say why derivatives are bad. I've said why they're good. Because they ensure stability in a supply chain and hedge against volatility, so that farmers make sure that they can pay their staff, they can invest in the future.
It depends on the circumstances.
You need to counter my point.
I can counter your point.
Derivatives for the end of the world.
I didn't say derivatives to the end of the world.
I'm giving you an example.
I didn't say the end. Well, now you're telling me how I have to counter.
I was giving you an example.
So I will counter in a completely different way. Firstly, the general purchasing of resources from, for example, commodity traders, particularly in countries like cocoa-producing countries, perhaps Nigeria or Congo, or I'm not exactly sure where cocoa is produced, but countries like that, those countries, the suppliers, the people, the farmers who sell those things, it depends on the circumstances those people are in. They may want to secure long-term profits, but the reason they might want to secure those long-term profits might be because they're in desperate straits, might be because they don't have any marketing system representing large numbers of them, maybe because the commodities market in London sets the prices for them rather than marketplaces in Nigeria itself. And therefore what happens is, and I've had people come up to me who are involved in trading in coffee, for example, and they came up to me and said, I remember this one guy, Shah, who was a regular at Speaker's Corner over a period of 2 decades or longer, and he used to come up to me. First he was a real boisterous pro-marketeer, and then he came up to me one day and he goes, I don't believe in that anymore. I said, what's that? He goes, capitalism. I said, why is that then? He goes, because I went to Uganda, I saw the people we're buying coffee from, and they're living in utter penury, and the desperation created by the market control of price setting in London. Is the cocoa price set in London? It's get wet? Chicago. Not set in Lagos, no?
No, it's set in Chicago.
Chicago. How long has it been set in Chicago for? When was it set in Lagos? When was it set in Africa? Never. Right. So there you go. So in other words, what you have described, even though you may be completely accurate in your description as to the specific motivation of the cocoa farmer to make profits 5 years down the road, the reality is because the price is set in Chicago, and according to you, has been since the 1940s, and according to the best of your knowledge, has never been set in Africa, the cocoa farmer can never and has never had command over their commodities. And therefore the manipulation to force them to sell, to make any secure profits into the future for their commodity, guarantees the slavery of Africa to the Chicago market. That's the reality of what you've described.
We were talking about the efficiencies of a derivative contract.
The efficiency for who? For who? The efficiency for Chicago, not the efficiency for Lagos.
So if nobody bought from a Nigerian cocoa farmer...
My friend, I'm sure you know quite how poor Nigeria is. I'm sure you know how Nigeria is. Okay, they've got oil, but otherwise, if you look around Lagos, the place is living in penury. I know many people who come from Nigeria.
By the thousand every day to Italy, the Nigerian.
Back to what? Back to
Go
what?
to Venice, there's nothing but...
You described to me derivatives. We dealt with the derivatives you described. We dealt with the derivative you described about a commodity you chose, and I showed you exactly what was wrong with it. So now where's your reply?
What you managed to do is you...
Where's your reply?
It's here, it's coming out of my mouth now.
Good.
You know my mouth is moving and
Okay,
I'm kind of waving my finger.
Fire away.
So we were talking about the efficiencies of a derivative. Which I
In relation to cocoa.
In relation to cocoa. Now you circumlocuted the point and you kind of managed to go to this place of communism again and saying...
I didn't talk about communism, I talked about Lagos
they're not getting
and
a good enough deal.
Chicago, which
So
you
let me
mentioned.
let me ask you a question. If nobody bought from that cocoa farmer in Lagos, nobody bought their product, here futures contract 1 to 5 years down the line, nobody bought it, would their quality of life be better or worse?
But whose scenario is that?
It's my scenario.
It's your scenario. I don't wish to engage in that scenario.
So if nobody bought
people
their cocoa,
like
they had no
coffee.
sell, no
People
industry,
like
no
cocoa.
nothing. Yeah,
Simple
but if
as that.
nobody bought it,
Why
what
should
would happen?
nobody buy it? What sort of scenario is that?
I'm saying if nobody bought it.
If
so
nobody
the
ate
price wasn't
baked
fair.
beans, is that your argument?
No, not at all.
If nobody drank tea,
No, not at all. But if the price
what sort of
wasn't-
stupid argument is
It's not an
that?
argument. If the price
So you're
wasn't-
coming up with a
it's not.
clever
The
banker's
price-
derivative knowledge,
No, listen to
enhanced
me.
explanation.
Listen to me.
Where is it?
Listen to me.
Cocoa, Nigeria. Tell me the benefits of the derivative again.
No, I'm not talking about derivatives. We're now talking
You
about
were
price.
you
No, but we're
grabbed
talking
me
about
because I
price.
said derivatives.
No, but now we're talking
You
about
said you
price.
don't know what a derivative is. You explained what a derivative is. You referred it to cocoa. Then you said, what's wrong with that? I then explained what was wrong with it. You haven't responded to defend your position. Please do so. Sorry? Please do so.
So if we went to,
Because
so
he's
if we talked
diverting
about-
the subject.
I'm not diverting the subject. I was going to talk about price.
Cocoa.
So the price of cocoa. So you live in this, sort of utopian world whereby everything you've got better
Whereby the
prices.
people of Lagos get something back from what they produce.
Well, they do get something back. They get money back from what they produce.
From Chicago.
Well, they get whoever the buyer is.
Sorry?
Whoever buys their cocoa. I don't know who buys the cocoa. Whether it's Cadbury or Nestle.
Right, Cadbury or Nestle. Here we get round to it.
Okay. So
Cadbury or Nestle. Who are the biggest food controllers of the world supply of food?
Nestle's number one.
Right.
I think Kraft.
Right. There are giant corporations controlling world markets, right? So the cocoa farmer that you claim to be defending through derivative markets, what's their position in relation to Nestle, Cadbury's?
A derivative doesn't establish price. Price is established by the market, by what the market deems to be fair.
Right, but who's
So if I
controlling
can
the
buy-
market? The farmer in Nigeria
depends on
or
buyers and sellers.
Nestle?
No, it's buyers and sellers.
Buyers and sellers. The seller is the farmer in Nigeria. The buyer is Nestle. Who's got the power?
You should have studied economics at university. This,
Sorry?
China's communist doctrine.
Political economy is what I studied at.
You should have studied economics, flat economics. Surely if you study economics...
So what are you
understand
talking about?
Supply and demand. You can't just
My
dictate
friend.
the price of something. The thing is,
I'm
you're
sorry.
talking about-
What sort of world do you live in?
In the real world.
Well, that's not the real world, is it? You are saying this
What, so-
equal power.
so you say that we should
You're
set
saying
prices.
a farmer
So set
with
prices.
2 acres of land growing cocoa in Nigeria has the same power as Nestle buying his product in Chicago on the derivatives market. What sort of cuckoo land do you live
He can
in?
sell it to whoever he wants.
Give him a chance.
How can he sell it to everyone?
He can sell it to you, he can sell it
What
to
a
me.
lot of
He can
nonsense.
sell it to the best
What a
bidder.
lot of nonsense.
He can sell it to the best bidder.
How?
That's the way that the market
By what
works.
mechanism?
Any mechanism that he wants to.
I mean, this is nonsensical argument. The truth of the matter is, the world market, world trade, world economy is dominated by a handful of companies.
So what do you want
the
to do
derivative market
So
and
you
the
think
cocoa
the
market
solution
is dominated by 2 or 3 companies.
break them up?
You're trying to pretend that some free market where everyone buys their cocoa on Amazon directly from the supplier.
That's your
That
point.
is rubbish.
That's your point. My point is
No,
that
that's
the
not my
mechanism we've
point.
got at the moment-
When did I argue that?
Because you were saying
When
that
did
big
I argue that?
corporations- Big corporations are buying all of the cocoa, so
They do.
surely, so they shouldn't be allowed to buy it? We
I
should
didn't
break
say
them
that.
up. We
I
should
said
divide
they should be
them up.
publicly owned.
Who should buy it?
I said these companies should be publicly owned. They are not free market competitive entities like you're imagining they are, where
They're
they're
not, because there's
equal
too much
with the
regulation.
cocoa
There's too much-
trader.
wait.
They are giant monopolistic and oligopolistic companies that dominate the entire world.
Let's define publicly owned. You
There
want
are
you want an angry mob
740
to invade,
companies.
to invade the companies, to kill the leaders, and to give the ownership to another person.
One second.
Let's define your version of publicly owned. You want an angry mob to invade their, their headquarters, to kill their
angry.
leaders, to put another guy in
I didn't
rule,
say kill people.
and to say, the people are deciding now. That's the same
I didn't
thing.
say angry mob. I didn't say there's plenty of angry people around now.
That's what it
right?
is.
The issue
How
of
do you
Brexit,
expect
no
it will
Brexit,
be
seems to have
publicly
brought out
owned?
all kinds of beasts amongst
Do you
people.
expect
That none of that's my
property owners
creation.
will just, lay on their backs and say, okay, take all my power, take all the power from me. It's
No,
publicly owned
no,
now.
but that's what happens today. What happens today is the majority of people are, to use a French phrase, buggered up the arse every day, right? By their employer and by their landlord. That's the truth of the matter. The majority of people are buggered every single day, right? When they go to the shops, they're buggered. And the people who are buggered worst of all are the poorest people.
So let me ask you a
If
question.
you're poor, I mean, even at the minimal level, the poorest people in Britain, what do they offer them? They know that person can't afford to buy a 60 pence tin of Tesco beans, so they buy a 35 pence tin of Tesco beans that's less than half the size of the 60 pence one.
I'm going to ask a sensible
Therefore,
question.
they're more
Can
ripped
I
off
ask a sensible
than the wealthier
Socialism
people.
will never solve
Can I ask
it.
you-
It will only make matters worse.
What you said was something different. You said
What
to
I
me,
said was how
you may have a
socialism gains
normative
power.
anti-socialist
Can I ask a
perspective.
question?
Good for you. We know that. The question is, we're dealing with the specifics now. And the specifics we're dealing with are those you raised. And what you raised was
What did
the
I
example. Well, you said that it's unfair for an angry mob to take away the property of those who've got property. But the truth of the matter is, the majority of the population have obviously had their wealth taken away from them, because in 2 million years of the existence of hominids, most people in the world don't have any property at all.
But their quality of life is significantly increased. in the
Is
last
it
2 million
really?
years.
Compared with what?
Are you in favour of
Compared to
property?
2 million years ago. You sleeping in a cave and you had a stick.
2 million years
Yeah, I
ago,
don't know,
yes.
yeah. Should we all have property?
Yeah, I sleep in a
I believe we should have property.
Yeah, public property.
The problem is this. No, you've misunderstood that as well.
I misunderstood.
What I
You're
said
against
was,
private property.
I'm always quite specific. What I said was, I believe in public ownership of the commanding heights of the economy. And I've specified again and again, and you've been at the meeting when I've done this many times. By that I mean, the largest 150 companies in Britain should be in public ownership. There are 6 million private companies in Britain. The largest 150. So a tiny minority of the private companies in Britain, I am advocating they should be in public ownership. Now that doesn't mean everybody suddenly loses their property.
Okay,
On the
two
contrary, I believe that will result in a big increase in the private property of the majority of the population.
Home ownership, then, that's okay. Home ownership.
I'm not opposed to home ownership. I don't advocate it as an objective itself, but I'm not opposed to it.
You know when you said that people get buggered when they go to the shops? You say when people go to the shops they get buggered.
Yes.
That's fair to say that you said that, okay?
I did say that, yes.
Okay. So going back to
I said the
point,
poorest people most of all. I'm qualifying what I said
you married?
so that you remember what I said.
Fine. Can I get my points? Look, no. So going back to the
Well, why don't we have any then? Thank you very much.
So going
You
back
answer
to the
my
point.
point.
Of the cocoa farmer.
So in other words,
So going
rent,
back to the point of the
rent.
cocoa farmer.
Oh, the gentleman here
Going back
said
to
something.
point of
The
cocoa
gentleman
farmer.
here said something. I thought you were leaving.
When the cocoa farmer gets
I thought you were
a
going to
better
run
deal-
away.
Finish his sentence. Go on.
When the cocoa farmer gets a better deal under your utopian view of society where everybody's all happy and everybody gets a fair share of everything because that's the way it should be, what would happen if you paid the cocoa farmer more? Would the individual, the consumer that goes to the shop, when they were getting buggered before, if you pay the producer more, would they be more or less buggered under your utopian scenario? Because I think more.
I haven't researched the condition of cocoa farmers around the world.
That wasn't the
I
question.
will. I'm sorry, I didn't realise I
It's
have
a
to
yes
ask.
or no,
I didn't
more or
realise.
less buggered?
I didn't
The
realise
price
it's a yes or
increases.
no. Because if it's a yes or no, I'm stuck, aren't I?
Well, if
Because
they
you're
were
going
buggered
to
before-
stuff me with a yes or no.
So they're buggered and the price
After
is
all,
here. So the price
if
is
that's
10
all
and
you
they're buggered,
want,
the price goes to 15.
you don't actually
Are
want.
they more or less buggered?
So in other words,
They're more buggered.
in other words, you don't have a question for me. You have an answer for me.
I'm just asking.
No, you're not asking.
Well, are they
asking
more or
me.
less buggered?
All you're doing is telling me what your viewpoint is,
my viewpoint.
under the auspices of a yes or no
Logic.
question, right?
If something becomes more expensive, if somebody's buggered when they pay
As I
10
said,
pence for it,
I
and
was
then they pay
beginning to
15
answer
pence
your
for it, they're
question,
more buggered.
but you're not happy with an answer.
I'm trying to put it into
You
your
want the
words.
answer that you want. But of
Okay.
course, if I was actually to do that, then you'd claim victory.
Fire away.
So instead of that, I will answer how I want.
Okay.
Sorry, that's Speaker's Corner.
Yeah,
I have an
get to-
independent
yeah, all right,
mind.
Dramatisation
Now,
gets to the point, man.
well, it can't all be as boring as you want it to be, my friend.
Just get on
Now,
with it.
if a cocoa farmer produces cocoa and is poor, which I believe probably the majority of small cocoa
He's
producers
better off than
are,
he would be if he didn't produce any cocoa and nobody bought it, but okay.
is that an argument?
Yes, it is, yeah.
So in other words, the philosophical standpoint the gentleman makes is, no matter how shit someone's condition is,
It could be shittier.
it could be shittier.
Yes.
That's it.
Without the
That's
phenomenon
your
we're
argument.
discussing, so
Well,
it
I
must
think
be
that
better.
somebody with
Not
a
without
job
the
is-
phenomena.
somebody with
He's
a
just
job
saying
and
in
an
general.
So, no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying
In other words,
somebody with a
if
job
I
and
if
something
I
produced
if
and
I
market
make
to
money,
sell to
if I make
is
money,
better off than somebody that has absolutely nothing and no
if
need
I
to
make
provide
money
anybody.
by, as I do, doing walking tours, right? And someone came round and said, you're no longer allowed to do walking tours, I'd be worse off than otherwise. And therefore, I shouldn't complain if, for example, someone is coming around and trying to break my legs for doing the walking tour, because they want to do my walking tour. I should be quite happy about everything. I should allow anyone to shit on me.
He's saying doing the walking
reducing
tours
the
is
argument
better
to
than
the-
doing nothing. If that was the only other option, that's I think effectively what he's saying.
Well, yes,
You
fair
can't
enough.
reduce the argument
But
to
what
an
about?
absurd point when somebody comes and breaks your legs? That's not fair. You know you can't do that. The Latin
But
for
you
that is
see,
what
I
conduct
did
you ad
point out,
absurdum.
which was confirmed by you,
Yeah, but you're reducing
that the
argument to an
example you
absurd
gave to justify the theory about derivatives that you had
I
was
talking
that
about you
cocoa
having your
farmers
legs broken.
are greatly
Yes,
benefited
but you can't
by the
compare.
derivative
But you
market
can't compare.
based in Chicago,
You can't compare.
dominated by Nestle and Cadbury's and Co,
compare.
dominating the world market for cocoa. That's a good thing.
You can't
And if they don't
compare.
like it, we could fuck them some more.
You
wouldn't
can't
buy
compare
Perrier
having your
water,
legs
that's a
broken to there
bourgeois
being a market for
brand of
cocoa.
It's
water.
and
actually
not
from the
being a
tap.
market for cocoa.
It's actually from the
Good
tap,
man, I withdraw
filled
that
up.
absolutely, and I commend you for your thrift.
But it is a bit of a puerile comment anyway, isn't it?
Well, not if it is Perrier.
No,
then
it would be a puerile comment anyway.
If I was
If
right,
I happen
it
to
would
be
but
here-
if I was wrong, it is. Yeah.
So you're saying, because of my nature of my argumentation,
No, nothing
that
to do
I
with the
cannot buy anything
No,
anywhere in the
It
world.
was an observation. That
But
I
that,
could see there's
what's the
water
observation based
there,
upon?
by what I see in
What's the
between your
prejudice
legs.
you want to impose on me?
The prejudice would be that the water, if it was genuine water, could you hold it up? Let me make sure I've got it right, because I could have it wrong. Can you see what brand is that?
It's a Pellegrino.
Okay,
The person
if
that
you
made
were
that water
drinking
get a fair price for it.
genuine Pellegrino water, you would be paying way over the odds that you could have got that from Lidl.
See, when
And
I
was just
discussed,
using that as an observation,
when
that's
I
all.
began this discussion and you
doubt
first
you're a
got
good man
involved,
anyway.
you wanted to discuss the grand issues. Brexit,
I
no
just wanted to
Brexit.
make clear.
Chocolate,
That was the initial.
water.
Now we get on to global issues and the
Like
way
some
the
kind of
world
creative-
is organised. You
And
want to
hot
divert
chocolate.
the
Hot
issue onto my personal circumstances,
Yeah, of course.
right? So now it's about, do I
Symptoms
buy
of
bottles of
hypocrisy is
water?
what we're trying to find.
Do
yeah.
I wear a coat or not coat? Do I go and eat a McDonald's hamburger?
do you?
That's the type of level of debate that you now want to have. Because you
This
lost
speaker's
the argument.
corner. This is
You
speaker's
lost the
corner.
argument on the totality, even on the terrain which you chose. And instead of dealing with that argument and accepting the foundation upon which I explained the system is based, you jump issue onto what shoes I'm wearing, what coat I wear, or what water I
What's the
drink.
subject? This is because the subject doesn't seem to be apparent. You're talking about the cocoa farmers, and you're talking about your legs being broken. I'm not quite sure.
We're
what
talking about the
issues are.
nature of what dominates. Large-scale corporations and banks, or the individual choice of either the producer of... You asked me a question, I'm trying to answer you so that you can grasp what my answer is. It's kind of difficult to do that when you're at the same time interjecting while I'm
I thought I'd
answering you.
speed it up a bit and get to the point.
I didn't know I'm under your command, but I respect that you're the god of Speaker's Corner, and therefore I must submit to everything that you want, and every discussion that you want, and every trajectory that you choose to take. So,
thank you.
The issue was about the power in society. It began about the question of Brexit, because a lot of people who voted Leave or voted Remain think that they've got some power over this question. That the decision of the people is going to be respected or not respected, or overturned. That they have some control over the process.
Is that not the case?
They have no control over it.
How so?
They did have control
None.
because they were given a vote.
The people of Europe have, or better said, qualified, have the most minuscule control of the political process. The people of Britain have the most minuscule control over the political process as well, because economic power is the source of political power, and economic power is in the hands of a tiny minority of oligopolistic companies that dominate Britain and the world. That is the structure of my argument. That's the structure of my argument.
The globalists,
Who are they?
This is where the power lies. You're talking about, let's talk about this phenomenon.
I'm not arguing anything of the sort, but if you want to clarify what you mean, explain what you mean.
No, restate what you just said. You were
I
talking
said
about
in Britain and the
power
world,
lies with
power lies in the hands of the largest companies that dominate Britain and the world.
Right.
Britain is a major player in that. One of the reasons why sections of the British establishment backed Leave, sections of the British establishment backed Remain, is because their economic interests are associated and have affinity to those specific structures of power.
I don't think Vote Leave had anything to
And
do
the
with the
people
economic
who
interests.
really suffer, whether we leave or remain, is the majority of the population, who, as I said, are buggered whether they do and buggered whether they
So
don't.
we're all buggered?
And that's, yes.
Right, and shall we
Yes.
move on to the next topic then? We're all buggered, great.
But I'm explaining
How are
how
you gonna
and
debugger
why.
us?
How and why
Maybe we
that
should
structure
bugger
of
off.
power is
We
organised.
should all bugger off then.
If you want to, you can do so.
I'm enjoying this.
Start it now. Start
Bugger
now.
off is great.
Bugger off now.
The essence of the question was this: who holds the power in society? The gentleman here and many people who advocate for capitalism, seem to imagine or be under the delusion that every individual, as a participant in the marketplace, has equal power in the market.
No, he never said that.
That's what he was arguing.
No, he didn't. He didn't make that
He did
statement.
argue that.
What
He
was
said the
doing-
cocoa
he- no,
producer
he
has
was
command over their
No, he
cocoa.
was illustrating that there was a relationship between the producer and the buyer. And the producer obviously is the person who's going to get less out of the cut than the buyer because
That's
he
not
sets
what he
the
argued.
price. No, but this is how the world works.
That's what you're arguing.
No, this is how the world works.
Well, that's what you're arguing.
I'm not arguing for it. This is just a fact.
Well, it may or may not be, but this is what you're
Well,
arguing.
it seems cooperatives seem to be an option, doesn't it? This is where you get fair trade and all the rest of it. That's what you want.
Did I argue for that?
Have you a solution?
Did I argue for that?
We've set out the
No, you're
the
assuming
parameters
that's
of
my
the
argument.
people. Give us a solution. What do you think the solution
The
should
solution, in my opinion, is public ownership of the 150 largest companies and banks in Britain, and a plan of.
Will they make
And who is going to control this public
The
ownership?
state
Is
will
it
have to
every
bail
single
them out.
person?
The evidence suggests that the state continually bails out these publicly owned companies because they're not as efficient.
We've just
And I'm
bailed
not
them out
saying
as
that's a
private
good thing.
companies.
Why wouldn't you address
Okay,
that point?
yeah.
Why wouldn't you address that point?
What point?
Because you seem to have
What
the,
point?
You seem to have an opinion
Address
of
what
somebody.
point?
I'm getting to it. You seem
You
to
said,
have an
why don't
opinion-
you address that point? What is the point? That is, I'm getting to it. You
seem
haven't
to
told me
have-
what the point is. What is the point?
So can you give me 30 seconds? Don't
Maybe.
say anything. So you seem to have the opinion of somebody who's bitter or resentful that perhaps they don't have
Not
as
bitter
much
or
money.
resentful at all.
Hear me out. They don't have as much money as perhaps
So
they
drop
might
that
have.
assumption.
They
Should
might
stick
have.
to the
Hear me
facts.
out. Hear me out.
What is the argument? Not what you think of me. What is your argument?
Push on through with
Stop.
it. Push
Okay,
on
so
through.
don't say anything. You seem to have this kind of thing that bitter and resentful people that don't have enough money hold against corporations because they're not as successful as perhaps they envisaged themselves being when they were younger. So you think that income should be redistributed because maybe you didn't work as hard as perhaps you should have done, and you're not as
You
successful.
believe
as you
everything
could
is
have
just a subjective opinion, right?
Well,
That's the essence.
Are you happy?
You believe everything is just a subjective
been. You
opinion.
seem bitter.
Obviously.
I am happy with it.
Great.
You seem very bitter.
Some opinions work though, and some don't.
I'm
That's
sorry.
the difference.
I'm sorry, my friend. If you think I'm bitter, give me a hug.
Can we all come in and have some of that? Have some Perrier board, eh? Don't be a capitalist. Look at that.
So
Supply and
the
demand
level
was
of
met
discussion,
there, wasn't it?
the level of discussion
It's a sweet moment.
We don't have to bugger off.
Such a sweet moment.
later.
It's a revolution of love.
That was a good turn. That was a good.
Now,
Yeah.
the argument I'm being
happy
given
now.
that I'm bitter and twisted and so on.
I didn't say
because
twisted.
Yeah, let's leave the ad hominem.
We know you're happy though now. That's good. Stay happy.
I
Stay
mean,
happy.
the level of discussion. The level of
He
discussion.
wants another hug. He's going to
The
put you in
level
a
of
position where
discussion
he gets
that
another hug.
entirely
He wants to joke
personalises
on. Yeah,
everything
the
is a
MMA.
foolish level of discussion.
No, but in a
Because
court of law.
can I try and
If you're in a
finish?
court
Can
of
I
law, then
can
you
I
do try and
try
take
to
somebody
finish
out on a
the
personal
answer to your question? So the level of discussion that focuses just on what my personal attitude is or not is a rather foolish method for engaging the discussion in geopolitics and in global economics. It is, however, often the case, and here I'll try and explain the subjective viewpoint that you have by an objective measurement. And that is, those people who wish to defend, and that's perfectly true from your own point of view, those people who wish to defend private ownership and capitalism as it is
This
today.
isn't capitalism. What we see now is not capitalism, by the way.
Can I finish? Often they will assume, as you do as well, that there's some personal animosity involved in attempting to challenge the wealth and power of the establishment. Marx was very clear on this, I agree with him.
Not exactly that.
The wealthy elites behave the way they do, not because they're nasty and horrible people.
Because they can get away with it.
They may be, but that's not why they behave the way they behave the way they behave. The way they behave is because they assume a mask corresponding to their condition. It's a tendential law, a law that applies like the law of the law that you get more ill as you get older. It doesn't mean everybody who's old is ill, but it means you're more likely to become ill as you get older. So it is that you're more likely to behave in an evil way if you happen to be a multi-billionaire trying to protect your money.
Power corrupts.
It doesn't mean that every billionaire is an evil, horrible person.
Okay.
Nor on the other side does it mean that those people who want to fight for social justice and change in
Well,
society
social justice,
are
I like
necessarily
that. Social justice
good people. They may be thugs, they may be
apparent.
criminals, they may be paedophiles,
They
they
may
may
be
be
rapists,
rapists,
they
they
may
may
be
be
funded by
racist, they
Soros.
could be anybody.
They may be funded by
However,
Soros.
could be me. However, if their cause seeks to bring about a change that I believe is just, then I will use phrases like
But what
justice
means would you use?
and social justice.
If being
I
rich
apply
makes
them
you go evil,
naturally.
then how did those poor people become rich? How did those millionaires become millionaires if they only become evil when they get rich?
I didn't say they only do that. I said there's a tendential law.
Oh, is there?
So there is
they
a
become
tendency.
more evil as they become richer.
Yes, for the
Yeah,
very
that's it. The more
let me
money you've
explain.
got, the more
Let me
evil you
explain to you a very simple scenario, so you can understand the process.
Please.
If you run a small business,
I'm very dumb. I'm very dumb.
well, you asked me about it. I'm answering you. I don't know how else I can answer you than at the level you requested me to answer.
Sorry, but
You said to me, you've said to me that a poor person becoming wealthy, you've, if you like, taken that analogy in order to try and subvert my argument. Therefore, I'm trying to give you an analogy in exactly that scenario to correspond with your argument in order to illustrate what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's a perfect, in fact, I haven't even made it up yet, but I'm about to. So, I set up a small business. Let's say I win the lottery tomorrow on a small scale and I get £200,000. And I decide to invest this £200,000. I decide... Sorry?
Cocoa.
It smells like weed here.
Marijuana.
What are you good at doing?
He's going to invest in that.
New jacket.
Give me an example. Okay. I decided to open a shop selling coats, right? And I'm going to purchase coats for various people, including this gentleman here. Right? Now, in doing so...
Is he going to get a fair deal?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Good question. I have an interest, naturally, given market conditions for selling clothes in London are quite tight.
Oh, so you're going to screw it.
I will have to worry about my margins. And in that, I will be trying...
All of a sudden, you've got the head of a business owner. When it's cocoa,
this is what we're discussing, isn't it?
You want to give him a fair
This is
deal.
what we're discussing.
Stop
This is
cutting
what we're
off.
discussing.
Stop cutting
We're
off what
taking
he's saying.
we are assuming a hypothetical scenario set by Pavel, is it? Set by Pavel here. We're taking his scenario to illustrate the process, the psychological process, which affects the human being. You are reinforcing my argument with your interjection.
Drag it out. Why don't you just carry on? Just get back to the point.
Because you interjected.
Yeah, I know, because you've got...
I wanted to draw in your interjection to prove my point.
Because a minute ago you were a communist and now you're some kind of...
Because I'm
evil
taking
business
his
owner.
scenario.
About his margin.
I'm taking his scenario.
Okay, go for it.
Why is there a tendential law for this process that capitalists gradually tend to become more, in inverted commas, completely normative terminology, evil? Why is there this? I'm saying to you, I said to you, I am not assuming this, but there is a tendential law, and it's because when you come to me with your coat, if I don't do well this week in selling my goods because of cold weather on Saturday, or better said, on Friday and Saturday, I'm not talking about should be, we're taking his scenario. We can talk about should be in another minute. I take his coat. How much do you want for your coat? How much do you want for your coat? So I can sell it.
How much do you want for your coat?
It is immutable. There's no price.
Can't buy it.
Okay,
How much will you sell it to me for?
Never.
Come here.
Never.
Never sell it.
Come
here. Say what you want to say.
Then I won't trade with you. Then obviously I won't trade with you.
I would not sell this.
Well, that's your use value, that's up to you. Okay, so that man who I a minute ago was offering a job, I'm no longer offering a job.
You're out of business.
I'm offering it to someone else. You, because you're very keen on markets and trading. Now, you then come to me with some clothes you want to sell.
I'm not selling you
What is my interest? You want to sell me some clothes, I want to sell them on the market. What is my interest?
in making sure that I get a fair deal because I'm a hard done by...
My interest is to make sure you get as little as possible, but you keep producing for me, preferably to meet the demands of the marketplace. So if I need 100 tomorrow, you can provide. If I need 50 tomorrow, you can provide. If I don't need any tomorrow, you won't be too moody and you'll still be able to provide in a week's time. That's my ideal scenario. A flexible friend, right, on the marketplace.
That's not my ideal scenario, is it? I'm getting, hard.
Exactly, it's not your ideal scenario, but you'll have to like it.
So what if I could ensure that I sold 50 jackets a day for 3 years, 5 years down the line with a derivatives futures contract?
Then I'm sure you'd go with that.
There you go.
So in other words, from me setting up a small business and dealing with real people, imagining real scenarios, even if only superficially, we end up back at the monopolisation of the marketplace.
No, because there will be other people.
That's what he's just
selling
said.
stuff.
That's
There
what
will
he's
be
just
other people
said.
selling stuff.
Supply and demand.
Yeah, supply and demand. Thank you, sir.
My friend, have you ever run a market store?
Yes, I have actually.
Where have you done that?
What's that got to do with it?
What happened to it?
I grew up.
What happened to
My
it?
dad's still there.
And is he doing well?
Yeah, yeah.
What market?
I don't want to say.
Oh, you don't have one, you mean?
What?
You don't actually have one.
No, I just don't want to
My friend, it's cheaper to run a market stall than to run a shop in London. I've run market stalls since I was 17 years of age. Covent Garden, Camden Lock.
That's not about the power
Camden
of the
Lock.
market. This isn't about the power of the market.
You're just telling me how marvellous the market was. Now you're saying it's not about the market.
I'm talking about the power of the market in economics.
That is a market.
I'm not talking about Brick Lane
When
market.
Alan Sugar,
I'm not talking about
when
East
Alan
Lane
Sugar
market. I'm
talks
talking
about the market
the economic
and he
power
wants to train
of
up
market
his
finances.
apprentices,
And
what
you
does
know
he ask
that
them to do?
Because you're a socialist, and the only thing that's good,
Sell things
socialist
at the
good,
elementary level.
capitalist bad.
Well, I'm sorry, my friend. I was just discussing the subject you raised.
No, I'm just standing in the back.
I then dealt
and I
with...
just heard you're banging on about socialism again.
I'm banging on what I believe. I'm sorry you don't like that. You don't have to listen to me.
Carry on. We're living in a lovely democracy where you can have your feelings and he can have his ideas as well. And we can all...
The reality is, I mentioned earlier on, and have you got what I was saying? I didn't need to continue with that argument, right? We saw how, from attempting to set up a small business, you can rapidly end up in a situation where you're really pissing people off. Intentionally or not.
We don't know what
it's
that's
an
like.
automatic function of the system. It's not because you're evil when you do those things. It's because the system produces a particular type of behaviour that automatically will piss some people off.
And pay for that
Now
fare.
you may
And
say,
pay for that fare.
you
And
may
those
say
trucks.
that's
And
an
those-
inevitable
that coat.
function of a system that is itself inevitable. That's a fair
That's
argument.
inevitable.
And that's what you've been arguing a few weeks. That's not the same thing as to say that those processes do not produce particular types of human action and behaviour. And therefore what I was saying was my initial statement that led to this was Karl Marx explained that people adopt a character mask corresponding to their condition. That's a tendential law within capitalism. That was my argument. So when you argued against me, as you did earlier on, you're a bitter person. When you argued that, you see, and the gentleman here said, oh, everyone's going to get angry against the capitalists. So what I was explaining was that the motivations, the moods, the attitudes that people form, even though sometimes they're called with the same labels, they have different origins. And therefore, when you say that the motivation of the small cocoa producer is the same motivation as Nestle's buying cocoa on the derivative markets in Chicago, that the same motivation is involved, that the same results are involved, it's an utterly false scenario.
All I ask is, so if you say that somebody, what were you saying about Karl Marx and they have a mask?
Character mask.
Character mask.
It's about how
So
psychology is created within a capitalist society.
So if I take that point, this isn't a capitalist society, by the way.
I believe it is, but you don't believe it is. That's up to you. You can fantasize whatever you like.
What is it?
Can you elaborate on that point?
What is it? There's too much regulation. Government's too big. There's too much regulation.
At what point? What specific regulation ceases
He wants
What specific regulations make it non-capitalist then?
There's too much regulation.
What specific regulations make it non-capitalist? In other words, what regulation do you have to take away for it to be capitalist?
One tax code. You should have one tax code.
And that would make it capitalist again, would it?
Health and safety requirements.
Was Britain ever capitalist?
A free market. Do you know where a free market
Was
works?
no? You're saying capitalist. You said capitalist.
I'm talking about free market capitalism.
When has that existed?
It's never existed.
So in other words, no world, nothing in the world has been capitalist. Nothing in the world will be capitalist.
Well, Switzerland's quite a good example. There's a lack of regulation. So free market capitalism is a small.
Switzerland's a lack of regulation. Good on you, mate. Try visiting Switzerland, my friend.
Anyway, you know what you were saying about the sort of the psychological, the mask thing? So you have the mask of somebody who's oppressed. So if somebody who's oppressed, they don't have perhaps enough money, or their standard of living or their house isn't of good enough quality, as we established earlier, then it kind of means you've got this bitter and resentful attitude.
I don't have a bitter and resentful attitude.
In the same way that you say that somebody who works in big business is evil.
You're saying the mask thing works both ways.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Of course it does. I'm not denying that. Of course it does. It's self-evident. Self-evident in the argument. I said so. Self-evident in the argument.
So I'm saying that on the flip side of that, somebody that's oppressed and is bitter and resentful about their own personal situation will always argue for income to be redistributed because they deem the system to not be fair.
Not always, but depending on circumstances, yes. For example, the revolt in France over the last weeks. Now, a lot of people who want to be objective, outside, non-committal, they will turn around and say, well, I don't approve of the violence. They say, I don't approve of the barricades. But you see, in France, the attitude is slightly different. Because they have a long history of revolts. They understand that change comes about often by revolt, and you can stop governments by revolt. And so the attitude in France is overwhelmingly supportive, despite the violence. And I've been in France when there have been riots and so on going on. And I remember distinctly remember being on a metro train, elevated above one of the streets around, I think it was around Montmartre area. And some students had turned cars over and set them on fire. And they were very middle-class women, and they looked out the window and went, that's the attitude there.
But that's somebody's
so
car.
You see...
That's somebody's car, they needed to get to work. That's not the government. Why are they doing that?
No, but the issue is, you're talking about the bitterness of the lower strata.
Yep.
Now, I'm not disputing.
But the lower strata,
I'm not disputing. One, personal confession. Two,
of society, because you say that big corporations control
99%
as well. So the lower strata is actually the dominant strata, which is 99%.
The lower strata is the dominant strata. It is not 99%. The Occupy movement is incorrect in this. You're not. Oh, yes, I did say that. It doesn't mean that big corporations only have 1%. So in fact, there could be corporations that have less than 0.1%. Right? But the 0.01% have underneath them exploiters, sub-exploiters, sub-exploiters, reaching right down into the population.
Is that what they're referred to as, sub-exploiters?
I'm referring to them as such because you can understand the term. I believe it's not that difficult a term to understand.
Yeah. Right? And if I wanted to become an exploiter, how would I go about doing that?
I'm pretty sure you know that better than me.
Oh, really?
Maybe.
But hasn't that produced like one of the most successful countries in the world? America, isn't that one of the most successful? People are really struggling to get into the country because it's a land of plenty and it's a land
not anymore. Not anymore.
I think that's a slight mystification of the argument as to why people are struggling to get into the country. People are walking from Honduras. One minute. The gentleman made a point. I'm trying to respond to it.
I wasn't talking about referring specifically to
Honduras.
No, I was actually. You know, like I'd love to go and live in America because their standard of living's better. I think a lot of people. There's plenty there. There's a lot of money. It's a wealthy country.
Well,
it's a land of
it's self-evident that people, and that's not only in America, but it's everywhere in the world. It's self-evident, one, that people who don't have a lot of money would like to have a lot of money. Two, that people who live in a poor place would like to live in a wealthier place. And generally, people living in a freezing climate would like to live at least part of the year in a warm climate. people who haven't got a girlfriend and are heterosexual want a girlfriend. People who are homosexual and haven't got a boyfriend would like a boyfriend. You know, these are normal things for people to have or want to have if they haven't got them. However, you can't always have what you want by the methods of simply moving from one place to another. So what I'm talking about is how the world has become a global entity under capitalism, and how the system of capitalism produces on a global scale, covering the entire world, traversing national boundaries. Production is organised globally. Consumption is organised globally. And therefore I argue that if we had public ownership of the commanding heights of the national and the world economy, and we had democratic control over the resources of the planet produced by these large companies, we could create a world that is less imbalanced, less distorted, less warped, so that people didn't have to move from Africa if they want a reasonable life, or move from the countryside to the cities if they wanted a reasonable life in Africa or India or South America.
Okay, so
that they didn't have to move from the Midwest of America to the northeast of America in order to have a reasonable standard of living. They didn't have to move from Jersey or Camden to Jersey in order to live okay in Philadelphia. And therefore they didn't have to move from Peckham or from Eltham Forest to St John's Wood to have somewhere decent to live. There's nothing unusual about discrepancies in wealth. The question is, how do you deal with them rather than on an individual or on a local basis, on a global basis? How do you transform the balance of power? In relation to Britain, it's not complicated. There's a building across the road here, just in the corner there where that red light is. It's been empty for 30 years. It's in Park Lane. You walk down the road here, the rest of Park Lane, there's at least 7 or 8 100 million pounds of money sitting in empty buildings that are standing, and people sleep homeless in front of them.
That's wrong, but our system
So you're
works.
telling me
Our system
what's wrong
works.
with
It makes
people?
us rich.
You said to me, what's wrong with people trying to migrate from one place to another?
So if you open up
I
those houses
extend
in
that and I
Mayfair, how many
say,
people
what's
could you get
wrong
in
with people getting a key cutter and going into the building that's empty?
Because what will happen at that point, you'll get like what's called the bailiff come and
Exactly.
But the only problem is,
So change the law.
But then I should be able to, so I can just come into your home whenever I want to. I can just come
It's
into
an
your house
empty
and
building.
come in and-
Empty, not unoccupied, not occupied.
But that's not going to solve the problem of homelessness, is it? If you open up all the
Gentlemen's
built
talking.
in Stratford when the
Wash
Olympics
your
will be
ears.
built. Okay, so then they put the Olympic Stadium going to be built. We're going to build these high-rise properties. People will start buying them, but it's not the case. People are not buying them. They built them.
My
they're
friend,
not renting them
my
out,
friend,
not giving them to the council.
my friend, this is because the issue you raised about people moving from one part of the world to another. Let me just answer. Let me just answer the gentleman. Let me answer the gentleman here first of all.
It makes us rich.
The issue you raised has affected the London market
But the difference
to
is
the
it's
degree.
not.
Let me answer this gentleman
No,
here
but it's a
first.
false
Let me
comparison.
answer him.
It's a false
Let me
comparison.
answer him.
I'm going
What
now,
it
by the way.
means
Nice to meet
is,
you. Have a good evening.
what it means is that billionaires from Egypt, when Mubarak fell, they fled the country. Where do you think they went to? They came to England, to Switzerland. They put billions into the marketplace. They built shell companies in Panama, in the Cayman Islands, British protectorates. They used those shell companies to buy buildings in London and jack up the prices. Half the buildings that they're building now on Battersea and they're empty, and they remain empty. There are enough empty commercial properties, not even house, commercial properties in London, to provide homes for 400,000 new homes, according to the Policy Exchange. That's a Conservative Party
I can
think
also
tank.
verify 110% solid, tangible fact. On Berkeley Street, number 10, there is a building right opposite Novikov, okay, Novikov Bar Restaurant. It says number 10. There's a bunch of blocks of flats. At night, you will only see 2 lights on. Every night, Monday to Sunday, 2 lights on. One on the bottom left-hand corner, one in the middle. 2 lights on every night. Why aren't the rest on?
Well, there was a study done of empty buildings in Britain, and they showed that the highest proportion of empty buildings in Britain is in Kensington and Chelsea and Mayfair.
They don't want to buy them.
So it's the billionaires are the precisely the people. The gentleman says, oh, you should be able to move. They move around the world with their money, and they park it in places where they think they get a solid asset. That is why you see we have a housing crisis in Britain.
Secondly, there is an area in Shoreditch called the New Era Estate. It was a council estate. The Chinese have bought the entire estate. It surrounds an entire basketball court.
Investors.
Yeah, the investors, they're Chinese. Okay, the Chinese bought it. The Chinese bought this entire council estate. Not one person living in that entire estate. The New Era Council Estate, just off Shoreditch High Street.
Where is that? Where?
Basically, this is when you go on the Curtin Road. No, when you go on Great Eastern Street from Shoreditch. If anyone knows Shoreditch High Street Station, okay, there is an area where Shoreditch House is. Behind Shoreditch House, there is a tower. There is a bunch of brown buildings, all brown buildings.
Okay,
There's an area
I'll
called
check
the
on
New
that.
Era Estate. Okay,
will
the
check
New
on
Era Estate is a council estate, completely empty. Not one single person living there. Not even the council have been eradicated from the entire estate. And not even one family living in that block.
Well, this is
and,
the general
this is not publicised, okay, and this is not blasted upon any type of social media, the news,
because it becomes so normal for people to see these things that and also there are people justifying it, like the people who were standing there earlier on, going all the time, well, but it was my property, my property, my property. The truth of the matter is, if the properties are sitting empty, as they are all over London, all over Britain, a policy should be introduced to seize those properties and use them for the people. I've been speaking a long time. We've lost our audience. Thanks very much. See you again later.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I really admired when you was having the speech with some of the members when the far right came down here and one of them pulled your hat off.
Content over everything. From your government. Man, say it straight. Man, don't listen to BBC. Man, don't listen to ITV.
Yeah. And objectively, I noticed that the world of objects has a causal effect on me as a subject.
Yeah.
I got anaesthetised 3 days ago. All of my emotions and feelings, you'd be amazed how much you chuck an object in me and it will change my experience.
Yeah.
There seems to be, unfortunately, a causal relationship between matter and my psychology and emotions.
Yeah.
Now, although I feel like I'm a free-floating spirit in here, the evidence suggests that it's not quite that simple. The neurology of what creates